Welcome, and thank you so much for being here. This is just my third episode, so clearly all this podcasting stuff is brand new, and there's much to learn. Like, for example, I should plug my microphone into my computer, something I forgot to do in episode one. There is also much to be grateful for. I mentioned in episode one what a hard personal growth journey creating this podcast had been for the past 2 years. Coming up from the underground after over 40 years of hiding stirred up a tremendous amount of angst and existential terror. It was crazy and ridiculous on some level, but at the same time, it was very real, and I needed to clear it before I could move forward. Some of that fear is still here, and I find myself still procrastinating and hesitating in my promotion of this podcast. But I'm noticing and trying to not let that fear drive. I'm calling it out here because these are fears we all have. So naming it is helping me to move through it. And hopefully, it will inspire you to move through your own fearful, stuck places and your own resistance around your own soul projects. I do have two things to celebrate around this that I wanted to share before we dive into the topic of this episode. The first is that I was at a party this past weekend with Roman Mars, the podcasting god and professional radio producer. I told him I hadn't plugged in my microphone for my first episode, but rather than re recording it for the ninth time, after realizing it, I had decided instead to embrace imperfection, something which my control, perfectionism aside, really didn't like. And he provided some powerful advice for all of us. The first thing he said was that he and Ira Glass from NPR had actually done a show where they told all the stories of all the things that had gone wrong in their radio careers, and everybody had loved it. And he also said, if your first show is your best show, you're doing something wrong. And that has definitely been true for me. In 1984, I was a sophomore at Chapel Hill in North Carolina, and I had just landed my own DJ spot at WXYC. Now, it was not a highly desirable spot since it was 2 to 6 a.m. on Fridays, but I was a night owl, and I was more than happy to sleep through the football games that would be happening on Saturday mornings. So I got the spot. So there I was with my very first show. All my friends were tuned in. Bill Burton, the radio station manager, was providing moral support and standing next to me. The last DJ's song ended, and my job was to provide the FCC mandated station ID at the top of the hour, which was the words WXYC, Chapel Hill, with nothing in between the station call letters and the location. Those are the FCC rules for station ID, which is to happen at the top of every hour. To be honest, I don't remember exactly what I said, but I absolutely put a word or two in between. I started my first song. I then turned to the station manager and said, see, I told you I'd F it up. Except I didn't say F. Bill then very calmly leaned over me and turned my microphone off. The phone lines lit up. I was mortified, and he also gave me some very good first show advice. Don't answer the phones. Breathe. Focus on queuing up my next song, and just keep going, which I did. I actually had a mildly successful DJ career for the next 3 years, and I even became music director for the last 2. And on my very last DJ shift, right before graduation, I intentionally used the F word again, in violation of FCC rules. But that is a story for another day. The second thing I want to share and celebrate is that I hadn't planned on sharing the podcast on my personal Facebook page, because that's where all the people live who had been in my fear consciousness these past 2 years. What would my neighbors, high school friends, in-laws, random acquaintances I met 10 years ago? What would all these people think about me announcing that I had been part of the underground world of psychedelics for the past 40 plus years. We all have these old ingrained patterns of needing to be liked and accepted. And boy, were those patterns getting triggered as I was creating this podcast. So it had not been my intention to share about this podcast on Facebook. Because of the year I had spent on Clubhouse, hosting rooms in the psychedelic clubhouse, I actually had a lot of psychedelic followers on Instagram, and it had just been my intention to promote it there. But then some of my dear friends started to share it on their own Facebook pages. And suddenly, I was faced with the reality that this was going to show up on my Facebook feed one way or the other. So I took the plunge and wrote a long, vulnerable post and hit send and went to bed. And what happened was really beautiful. I got an outpouring of love and support, some of it from those exact people who I had worried about previously. Maybe I lost some friends. I don't know. But it was well worth the risk to get that outpouring of love and support. So I'm sharing that for two reasons. First of all, to thank everyone for that. It meant so much to me. But also as a lesson for all of us about not letting our worries, fears, and anxieties stop us. I love this Mark Twain quote, and it's appropriate here. I've had a lot of worries in my life, most of which never happened. So I've got one more lesson for today, and that's around listening. In psychedelic space, we talk a lot about listening to the messages that come through, listening to your inner wisdom, listening to your spirit guides, listening to what the medicine is trying to teach you or share with you, listening for what's wanting to happen, not what we want to happen. So here's what I learned about listening this week. Initially, I had an interview scheduled for this episode, but unfortunately, my guest ended up having the stomach flu, and she needed to cancel 2 days in a row. But I needed to record something so I could get it out to my producer in time for it to be published. Of course, my first reaction was to try and figure out who else could fill the spot. And while I did have one other fabulous option who could fit the short time frame, everything was feeling forced and rushed and stressed. So I just stopped. Those weren't the energies I wanted underlying my third episode. Psychedelic space has taught me that when things aren't flowing, when you feel as if you're trying to push against the river, it often makes sense to stop pushing and to either swim to the shore or just relax and ask where the river wants to take you. And the answer to that question was to make it a solo episode. My guides reminded me that I will always be available as a guest, and the message was that this third episode was mine to record. Once I decided that, I felt immense relief and lessening of all the stress and anxiety. So I knew that I was in the right place. Then an hour later, something huge happened in the psychedelic world, and it became clear that that should be the topic of this episode. Hey, fellow explorers. Thoughtful planning and preparation is the foundation of any successful psychedelic journey. And if something does go wrong, knowing how to navigate that difficult space is essential. That's why I wrote my psychedelic safety guide, including what to do when things go wrong. It's filled with tips and tools for keeping you and your friends as safe as possible. You'll find it at our website, psychedelicdivas.com. Please, go get it, read it, and share it. The more we all know, the safer we can keep each other. Thanks. So what happened? Well, let me provide some context for those of you who aren't following all the latest psychedelic news. In 1986, the DEA placed MDMA into the category of a Schedule I drug, which meant the DEA felt it had no current medical use with high potential for abuse and or addiction. Other Schedule I drugs include heroin and cannabis. Notably, cocaine and fentanyl, which are both highly addictive, are not Schedule I drugs because they both have medical use. One historical piece that is interesting about the scheduling of MDMA is that in 1984, when the U.S. was fully committing to the war on drugs during the Reagan years, the DEA became aware that MDMA, or ecstasy, had escaped from the therapeutic world, where it was first introduced with excellent success stories. It had escaped into the dance club scene, and they wanted to shut that down. At that point, MDMA was still legal, but the DEA decided it should be scheduled as a controlled substance. Here's what happened, according to the book, The History of MDMA. In the process of scheduling MDMA, physicians and therapists who had been using MDMA for therapy demanded hearings with respect to the proposed scheduling of MDMA. The DEA was astonished to hear about the therapeutic use of MDMA, but nonetheless insisted that it represented a danger to public health and had to be scheduled. Hearings were held in 3 major cities in the United States in front of a DEA administrative law judge who studied the case and heard witnesses from the DEA and the physicians opposing the scheduling with regard to the 5 standard questions about the safety and medical use of MDMA, its abuse potential, and possible neurotoxicity. After collecting evidence on the 5 issues, the DEA judge concluded that MDMA should not be placed into Schedule I, but into Schedule III instead. Schedule III is defined as the drug has a currently accepted medical use in treatment in the United States. Abuse of the drug may lead to moderate or low physical dependence or highly psychological dependence. Nevertheless, the DEA overruled the decision of its own judge and placed MDMA permanently into Schedule I in 1986. That same year, as a result of this decision, Rick Doblin founded MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, with the intention to bring MDMA back into the legal therapeutic world. In service of that, MAPS has spent decades doing all the required clinical trials to prove to the FDA that MDMA has clinical therapeutic value. Those trials recently ended, and all the data had been sent to the FDA for review and hopefully federal legalization. The clinical trials had been studying the efficacy of using MDMA in combination with therapy to treat PTSD. And by all accounts, the results were good. Very good. So good, in fact, that the FDA had given MDMA fast-track status, which is a process designed to expedite the development and review of drugs, which may demonstrate substantial improvement over available therapy. Legal approval for MDMA actually had rare bipartisan support in Washington because so many of the trial participants had been veterans with PTSD who had actually had their PTSD cured in the trials. I was at the MAPS conference in Denver last year, and Rick Perry, the former governor of Texas and Secretary of Energy under Trump, was one of the final speakers promoting the legal use of MDMA for treatment of PTSD, especially for the veteran community. At that same conference, MAPS wasn't talking about if the FDA approved MDMA. It was all when it got approved. The conference was being heralded as a huge victory lap for MAPS and Rick Doblin for all their hard committed work in bringing MDMA up from the underground and back into the legal therapeutic world. Over 13,000 people attended the MAPS conference last year. I remember the first official psychedelic science conference I attended in 2010, which was hosted by MAPS, the Hefter Research Institute, the Beckley Foundation, and the Council on Spiritual Practices, and there were roughly 800 attendees from all over the world. To go from 800 attendees to 13,000 in 14 years was an amazing thing to witness and be a part of. The psychedelic world was riding high, pun very much intended. If we could have, we would have carried Rick Doblin out of that Denver conference on our shoulders. Everything the underground had always known about these medicines was being proven by science and was about to get legitimized. And then it all potentially came crashing down last week on June 4th when an FDA scientific advisory panel overwhelmingly voted against the use of MDMA for treating PTSD, putting its approval in doubt. Now, this was not full rejection from the FDA. This was an initial advisory panel that was reviewing the results. And then the full clinical results and the panel's report will go to the full FDA in August for approval. And it's still possible that the FDA will approve MDMA for treating PTSD. Perhaps in a reverse of history, where the initial advisory report to the DEA was to make it Schedule 3, and the DEA ignored that report and made it Schedule 1. Perhaps this time, the opposite will happen, and the FDA will ignore the advisory committee and decide to move forward anyway. We'll find out in August. So, as a life coach, I don't have the medical or research training to provide you with an in-depth analysis of what happened. I have linked to some good articles in the show notes available on our website, psychedelicdivas.com, that I hope you'll check out, as they provide good information about all the concerns the FDA advisory panel raised. Some of them seemed extremely valid. Others perhaps indicated some old school thinking about some decidedly new school substances. For example, the committee raised concerns that most participants and clinicians clearly knew whether the patient had received MDMA or the placebo. Doing double-blind experiments with psychedelics is obviously highly challenging. But the FDA helped MAPS design these studies and signed off on this aspect. So it seems a little disingenuous to come back now and say it's a problem. It is a problem. But if this is going to be a reason to reject these trials, then it seems unlikely that any psychedelic will ever get legalized. Unless you are doing a double-blind study between two psychedelics, you will always have this blinding problem. But as I said, I'm not here today to debate the advisory panel's decision. Instead, I want to use this platform to teach about how the medicine tends to hold us accountable. This is not the first time that this new emerging psychedelic world has been taken down. In the fall of 2021, one of the largest and most successful underground schools for training psychedelic guides, the School of Consciousness Medicine, they were rocked by allegations of sexual abuse involving the school's founders, Francoise Brzot and Aharon Grossbard. And this allegation exposed a much wider, deeply concerning pattern in the underground psychedelic world of sexual exploitation that had been enabled due to the fact that people didn't want to report the abuse because it would also mean exposing themselves and their abusers to criminal charges around illicit drug use. In other words, some of the victims were protecting their abusers because they didn't want them to go to jail for drug crimes. And they also didn't want to tell the world that they had been taking illegal drugs themselves. I highly recommend the podcast Power Trip from the first season of New York Magazine's Cover Story series. It is an amazing investigation into the seamier side of sexual exploitation in the psychedelic healing therapeutic world, including, sadly, the MAPS clinical trials. Those allegations, and to some extent the Power Trip podcast, took down the School of Consciousness Medicine, which had been poised to be one of the most powerful psychedelic training schools on the planet. As I watched that lineage and training protocol come tumbling down, the thought came to me that the medicine, in this case the mushrooms, which were an integral part of that school's training and future expansion, the thought came to me that the medicine, the mushrooms, had said no. It felt like to me that the mushrooms were saying, not in our name. We're not going to allow you to build an empire on our wisdom unless it is in full integrity. And according to Power Trip and a number of people that I personally know who trained in that lineage, full integrity was missing at times. Now, I'm not saying bad personal things about the school or the founders, both of whom I know. I think a lot of their teaching was impeccable, and they were training people with a high standard. But they weren't addressing these underlying issues when they were being brought up by students and clients. It's possible they let their goal of building the school to a level of preeminence blind them to some very core issues that really needed to be addressed before guided psychedelic therapy fully entered the mainstream. In my mind, the medicine said no. We're not ready. We need to address these ethical violations and bring them up above ground first so that they can be addressed and worked on. And so there was awareness of this potential for abuse. I know many underground practitioners who changed their touch protocols with clients as a result of these abuse stories. And that's a good thing. Holding both the above and below ground worlds of psychedelic therapy to a higher ethical standard is critical, because if these issues aren't brought into the light and discussed, they will continue to run amok under the surface, undermining the legitimate work that's possible with these medicines. So now, back to the FDA advisory panel's shocking vote last week. Reading all the articles that have come out since, I had the same thought. The medicine said no. In this case, MDMA was holding MAPS and the entire psychedelic research world to a higher standard. If there were problems with the trials, MDMA wants the world to know about it so that they can be fixed, not filed away. I have no idea how the FDA will vote in August, but I do know that the medicine is speaking to us. It's teaching us how to hold ourselves to the highest ethical standards. And when those standards have been breached, either with sexual abuse connotations or with possibly sloppy clinical trial results, the medicine is standing up for itself and saying no. These medicines hold deep wisdom. Unlike any other medication approved by the FDA, you won't just take a pill of MDMA and you're cured. Instead, you'll have a highly personal experience, ideally guided by well-trained therapeutic personnel who help you work through the messages provided during the experience. This work is not for everyone. No other FDA-approved medicine comes with a therapeutic component as part of it. If the FDA does approve MDMA, you won't just be able to get a prescription and take it home and do it by yourself. You will have to go to a trained provider who will first do a therapeutic intake to decide if MDMA is a good option for you. They will then start with some initial therapy sessions. Then they will sit with you while you take the drug and follow up with more therapy sessions post-experience. It's a brand new medical model that has never happened before, and it's essential we get this right. Because when it's not done well, it can cause the client, who is already experiencing mental suffering, even more harm. I know many of the people at MAPS, And I've known Rick Doblin since the 90s. They are good, heart-centered people who are deeply committed to expanding legal access to these powerful medicines. They have worked so hard since 1986 to make this happen. And I sincerely hope it does, because I know on a personal level what an amazing drug MDMA is and what an incredible therapeutic tool it will be. I know for the most part, it's a fairly safe drug, with some major exceptions, such as it's contraindicated for people with heart conditions and certain psychiatric disorders, or for people on certain psychiatric medication. But the reason I can say it's a fairly safe drug is because it has been taken millions of times all over the globe under all kinds of circumstances, from dance floors to Burning Man to intimate underground guided individual and group sessions. Millions of doses have been taken with very few deaths actually attributed to the drug alone, not counting combinations with other drugs. Is it 100% safe? Of course not. Nothing is. But it has been well tested for over 40 years in the underground. So I very much hope that the FDA sees and understands the new world potential of this therapeutic drug. But I also honor that for right now, the medicine said no. The medicine said we need to do some house cleaning so that the foundation upon which legal use of this drug will be built is strong and above board and highly, highly ethical. And I am quite certain we can get there, maybe even in August. So I'll leave you with one final teaching from the medicine, which is the difference between an intention and an expectation. In the psychedelic world, it's somewhat standard protocol to set an intention before taking any of these medicines. So what does that mean? When I work with my integration clients to help them prepare for an upcoming psychedelic journey, we talk about what they are hoping to achieve through the journey. What's the desire or drive behind the decision to take this particular medicine at this particular time and setting? People often express intentions of hoping to gain clarity around an issue they are working on, or to have a deeper understanding of how they might be blocking or sabotaging themselves. Sometimes the intentions are in depth, with many pages of notes. Sometimes they are a single, powerful sentence. What makes them an intention and not an expectation is that they are couched in almost prayerful tones. I'd like help with this. I need guidance with this. It's a request of the universe and of the medicine. I'm coming to you with this in mind, and I'm humbly asking for your help and insight to my request. Now, regular psychonauts know that while it's important to have an intention, when you actually enter the medicine space, the medicine is in charge, and you will get what you need, not always what you want. But still, the intention is a powerful part of preparing for any psychedelic journey. However, if we show up to a journey with an expectation, meaning we expect a certain outcome, the medicine is very likely to slap us down, maybe even a bit harshly, to let us know that we have entered a world of sacred wisdom, and it's best to enter such space with reverence, not demands. If we treat our intentions like little prayers to the universe, we are doing our best to stay in right relationship with the medicine. So how does this relate to the recent FDA vote? Well, I'm wondering if somewhere along the way, MAPS might have strayed from the intention of bringing MDMA and psychedelics into the mainstream, legal, above ground, therapeutic world. I'm wondering if they strayed into the expectation that this was a foregone conclusion. It's just a thought that maybe in the process of switching from an intention to an expectation, They lost touch with how the medicine wanted to be seen and utilized. I don't know for sure, of course, but I do know that the energy at the last MAPS conference was one of expectation. Legalization was happening, and after it did, then all these other things would also happen. And if you're running a giant company, of course, you need to have some expectations in place in order to create systems and roll out plans and other corporate metrics. But MDMA and other psychedelics have never behaved like other standard medicines. So we need to keep that in mind. They do have a will of their own. And just like any wise, revered elder, they are quite capable of smacking down any disrespectful entity who fails to treat them with full reverence. And that's just what happened with MAPS last week. It's possible they switched from intention, from the prayer of asking to bring these medicines above ground, to the expectation that it was a done deal. And the medicine said no. That's all for now. As always, thanks for listening or for watching, as we are also on YouTube. And thanks again to all of you who had such kind and supportive words to me around the launch of this podcast. It has meant so much to me. So thank you. If you want to follow us on Instagram, we are at Psychedelic Divas. That's plural, divas. Or consider sharing your email with us at psychedelicdivas.com so you'll never miss an episode. And you'll also get our invaluable psychedelic safety guide, including what to do when things go wrong. Thanks for being here. I look forward to growing together.